Anthony Lowenstein is the author of The Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us now from Sydney. Good to have you with us. So, Anthony, let's start with the role that these tech giants are playing when it comes to the conflict in Gaza, especially when it comes to surveillance.
Well, it's vital. And as you say, Project Nimbus has been going for a while. In fact, just in the last month, after years of denying that Project Nimbus was directly connected to the Israeli Defense Force or, in fact, any kind of military use, there was an interesting leak to Time magazine, of all places, confirming that, in fact, yes, Google particularly and Project Nimbus was directly working with the Israeli Defense Forces, including likely in Gaza. Now, obviously, we've seen in the last 6 months a huge number of AI-enabled tools in Gaza, essentially mass killing machines, so-called Lavender or the Gospel. And although we haven't got 100% confirmation that those Project Nimbus is involved, almost certainly they are, because they require massive amounts of cloud computing power. And sources I've been speaking to say it's likely that they are in use. And this, I think, really goes to the heart of the problem here, that big tech, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and others, are increasingly not just in bed with the Israeli military, but in fact are deepening their ties with the Israeli defense companies as well.
And Anthony, how much of a challenge are these protests, demonstrations, sit-ins posing to these tech giants' operations with Israel?
Look, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I've been following this story for quite a few years, and in fact, there's quite a section in my book on Project Nimbus and speaking to some people who have been protesting for a long time, long before October 7, and those protests are increasing, including often organised by a group called No Tech for Apartheid, which essentially is a US-based group which is opposing these kinds of activities and not just asking for transparency, which is the least that Google or Amazon could provide, but in fact exposing these companies to corporate risk, meaning that without direct action, as we've seen, for example, in the UK, in the last few years, Palestine Action has been which is essentially a public organisation fighting Elbit Systems in the UK, a large Israeli defense company, with a great deal of success, in fact. The similar tactics are being used in the US against Google and Amazon, correctly so, for their collusion with not just the Israeli military, but as I said, we're seeing since October 7, a lot of sources that I'm speaking to, and there's been even a few stories in the media, talking about how, in fact, the collusion between Silicon Valley and Israeli defense companies is increasing because Israel in Gaza in the last 6 months has been testing a lot of AI tools, not just Lavender and the Gospel, but others as well. And Israel, therefore, and Israeli companies need massive amounts of computing power. Amazon, Google are offering their services. And I think that kind of collusion is something that should just not just be exposed, but also fought against.
Some tech employees at Amazon have called for an international investigation in the past into the role their companies play in violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. Is there a failure here to hold these companies to any kind of review, let alone accountability?
Well, yes. I mean, there's been really no accountability. I mean, we've seen for years Facebook, Google, Amazon are essentially above the law. They really arguably are the masters of the universe because there's no accountability in the US or anywhere. And I think that really also shows that companies like this, in fact, see an appeal in the Israeli military. You know, a lot of the protests in the last years against Project Nimbus has come particularly from Arab, Muslim and Jewish employees, not all, of course, but many, who say that within those organisations they are silenced or bullied or in fact kicked out for even raising these kinds of legitimate questions. And the lack of accountability. I mean, look, in the last few years we have hard evidence that, for example, Facebook was complicit in genocide in Myanmar. What happened after that? Nothing. Facebook isn't held to account. If we have a situation where Google and Amazon in the coming years are found to be directly complicit in mass killing in Gaza, in the tools that Israel's been using, shouldn't someone be held to account for that? And at the moment, there's no indication that they will be without further protests that are happening in the US and beyond.
Anthony, I'm curious because you know some of the protesters personally, and as you said, some of these people have lost their jobs. They've been, as you you put it, silenced, bullied, or kicked out. What kind of impact is that having? Is that breaking the will of protesters and those who are disturbed by what their tech companies are doing?
In fact, it's the opposite, Sammy, that of course they may have lost their jobs, and that's obviously very hard for them initially financially, to be sure. But a lot of people I've spoken to over the years have not stayed silent, even if they've left or been kicked out of those companies. In fact, they've increased their public profile and discussion. As I said, No Tech for Apartheid's role as a advocacy organisation is growing. One can find their information online. I have no direct connection to them, but I've done events with them. And I really admire what they're doing because they are raising an issue of Silicon Valley complicity. And although people can take initially a financial hit for doing so, more and more as war is becoming automated, so-called automated killing, as we're seeing in Gaza and frankly at times also in Ukraine, there's even more need to hold these companies to account. And frankly, the US Congress, which has been asleep at the wheel for years, whether it's Democrat or Republican, needs to step up massively, as other countries do as well. And the EU, which has talked about this kind of regulation, has thus far done nothing concrete at all.
All right. Good to talk to you. Thanks so much, Anthony.
Thanks, Sammy.